So, excuse me. So there has been discussion in Parliament recently regarding the trolling of MPs and possible consequences of this. And one of the ideas being proposed is banning people from standing for public office if they have been presumably convicted of trolling offences. Um, I haven't followed this very closely. I haven't followed the bill in depth. So rather than focusing at great length about the legislation being proposed, although that's an important part of it, I want to talk about the wider subject of trolling, how we define trolling, and repercussions of this. Uh, I have long felt that trolling, to some extent, is one of those buzzwords that is used to kind of silence legitimate criticism and debate. Because one person's troll, i.e., someone who is harassing someone else online, is another person simply having strongly worded opinions online. And I think being clear about what this is very important. And because there isn't a single definition of trolling, that in itself is problematic. Um, I think in order to pass legislation, you need to be very clear about what something is. I'm sure this is going to be robustly debated. I'm sure it's not going to rush through, which is good. But there's a few things to point out. Firstly, there are people. There have been examples of people who are crossing a line from criticism or dislike of a particular politician to attitudes that really can't be condoned, whatever your political ideology is. So, for example, when female MPs are being threatened with rape, that is repugnant. It really is obviously crossing a line because it's focusing on something that has absolutely nothing to do with policy and it's a vicious, personalized threat. It's a threat. Um, but that's very different than just insulting an MP and saying you don't like them. When I was looking at this debate on a discussion forum the other day, someone made the point that there's double standards because MPs say things to each other, and within Parliament they may, be subject to some sort of reprimand for using unparliamentary language. But if we look at national newspapers, politicians are lambasted in satirical cartoons on a daily basis, and some of those are quite, they're quite brutal. I've seen Jeremy Corbyn depicted as a lizard by the Sun. I've seen Theresa May and other Conservative politicians portrayed in an extremely unflattering light by The Guardian. So satire can be very brutal. Why do we not consider that trolling? I personally think there is a place for satire. In fact, I think if you're a politician and you're satirized, it's almost a compliment because it indicates that you've made your mark in politics. You're recognized enough to be satirized. Um, that's how I would view it if I was a politician, and I would almost see it as a compliment to be satirized, even if it's unflattering, because it would indicate that I'm well known enough to be. But there is a serious issue with this, and it's to do with the extent of free expression online. Um, I think to be in politics, you need tough skin because if you're going to be in a job in a profession where you're making decisions that impact potentially millions of lives, then you have to be prepared for some very strong criticism. It's an absolute prerequisite to, I think, politics. It might be more important than anything else is having tough skin because the criticism that you're going to get isn't just like, oh, I disagree with that policy. It is sometimes outright vitriol. And it's not a good thing, but I think it's unavoidable because, particularly if you have a politician who's very passionately believes in something, there's going to be members of the public who very passionately believe in the opposite, whatever that might be. That's why you get, but well, basically all politicians are targeted. whether they be well to the right, whether they be well in the centre, or whether they be well to the left. So, just off the top of my head, Nigel Farage, Tony Blair, and Jeremy Corbyn are all hated by somebody. I'd like to say they're all loved by somebody as well, but the point is they've all been targeted. They've all attracted dislike in different ways. They've attracted support as well, and particularly with Nigel Farage and Jeremy Corbyn, very robust support. Um, so it comes with the territory that if you're in public life, and this is true to some extent with other public figures, actors, sports people, but particularly politicians. I mean, actors, people might not like their acting roles or their personality, but politicians particularly, they're impacting they're impacting other lives. So it's right that people have strong views on what they say and do. But there is also double standards when politicians make controversial statements, when they say provocative things. And I'm actually of the belief that politicians should be a bit more candid. I don't think politicians should be super cautious all the time. I don't think they should be politically correct all the time. I'd rather have a politician who offends me rather than a politician who says what I want to hear and then goes and does something else. I'd rather know up front what they believe in, and if that means I'm going to dislike it, so be it. At least I know where they stand. Um, so some of the MPs who are most vocal about trolling, one example would be Jess Phillips. Now, I'm not going to dispute that she may have had some of the sort of abuse that is unacceptable, such as rape threats, but she's no shrinking violet when it comes to saying provocative things. I mean, she's made sexist comments about men. She faced no consequences for that. Where she essentially said the Labour Party should have a leader who's a woman because we've had enough of white men, or something to that extent. That's pure sexism and racism. It's there's no way around it, and it's something the left always do. They make this sort of they tap into the worst sort of identity politics, but only if it's against white people and against men. So there's clear double standards there. Um, I mean, Jess Phillips can't complain about male um, internet users calling her names in perhaps a sexist way if she's, makes a sexist comments against men. And she's not the only one. There's many other MPs who say provocative things. But I would say perhaps it's a little bit more a domain of the left wanting a degree of censorship. I think you get that more on the left than the right. I mean, I don't often see conservative MPs calling for. I mean, take Ian Duncan Smith, for example. Ian Duncan Smith attracted enormous controversy when he was working pension secretary. And in my opinion, a lot of that was justified because the Tories' record in that was appalling. I was very critical of Ian Duncan Smith, but he never complained about the criticism. He never said, "Oh, I want protection from this." He Maybe it's from his background. He's a former army man, so maybe that just came with the territory. I don't know, but at least he didn't, call for people to be censored for criticizing him and for disliking him. Um, so I would say that politicians need to accept that if they're making controversial opinions, there's going to be a backlash. Now, if that backlash is in the format of disliking or even hating someone, it's not pleasant, but clearly that is very different from an explicit threat. Now, to me, there should only be any sort of criminal proceedings if there is a specific threat or if there is prolonged personalized harassment. So, for example, if someone is sending a particular MP nasty inbox messages to their Facebook page, to their to their email address, repeatedly, day in and day out, that can be considered harassment, and I think there should be some action against that. But if you send a one-off strongly worded message, I do not like this policy and you're a hypocrite, or you're an extremist or whatever. I think that is totally legitimate. And I'm going to say publicly here, I've done it. I've emailed MPs. I'll give a personal example. I emailed the Justice Secretary, David Gauck, recently because I felt strongly that he had been proposing double standards in the way that women inmates are treated. And he said, we need to review the way that we cater for women inmates. I felt strongly about that because I believe in equality. I believe if a woman commits a crime, she should serve exactly the same sentence as a man. And David Gauck, in my opinion, was virtue signalling to feminists. And I took issue with that. And I emailed him and told him as much because there have been examples of some terrible crimes committed by women. So the idea that women should get softer sentencing is absurd. So I emailed him and told him that. Um, but this is a crucial thing. I did not make any threats, and I wouldn't do that. A, because I'm not an idiot. I don't want to get a criminal record for threatening MPs. B, it wouldn't achieve anything. But I did write a strongly worded message because I feel that those in a position of power need to be held accountable. And if that means a member of the public, a voter, saying, I do not like this, I think you're wrong, that's it might not, he's not going to change his opinion and he hasn't replied yet, but it's a point of holding power to account by expressing dissent. That's for me the issue here, because otherwise we'll end up as a totalitarian state. I don't think it's going to happen, but we can never be complacent, such as a country like China or Turkey, where you get a situation where politicians are literally above criticism. And that's dangerous. So I do think that we need to be very wary of this. Basically, and politicians need to be wary about pushing it because they need to understand it will look like they're basically saying, "Oh, we're above criticism online." Now, trolling, if trolling is defined as harassment, then there could be a cause for criminal proceedings. But in my opinion, the only way that an elected politician should go after someone legally is if there is explicit threats or if there is repeated, targeted, ongoing harassment, not a one off message, not even a few messages, but if it's day in and day out for a prolonged period of time, that's obviously going too far. But in the end of the day, politicians are in a position of power, and it's all very well saying, oh, people can write letters and complain about something, but politicians know full well they can't address each and every letter, so it's not always practical. Sometimes expressing dissent in that way is legitimate. So for me, it is the issue of the democratic right to express dissent. And the idea that it should always be ultra polite, no, I don't think so. If someone is making policies that are potentially destroying lives, I mean, Esther McVeigh, for example, is a very controversial figure, Work and Pension Secretary. Um, as was pointed out when she was appointed to the role, that put dread into millions of claimants across this country, many of them vulnerable people who are disabled, who are fearing the sort of impact of work capability assessments. Esther McVeigh proposes very hardline responses in dealing with claimants. She's one of the most regressive Tories around, in my opinion. So I think it's totally legitimate that disabled claimants would express a deep dislike for her and for the things that she proposes. Now, that wouldn't justify threatening her. Um, and threats against MPs is a real problem. We know what happened with Joe Cox. We know that other MPs have faced, there's been violent attacks on others. So it's not a totally trivial thing. It's not like, they're paranoid. There has been attacks on MPs. So they've every right to defend themselves. And another thing I would add, though, it's about allowing dissent, but I would say MPs have a right to fight fire with fire. So let's say I call David Gauck names. If he replies and tells me to piss off, it would be a very unprofessional response, but I couldn't complain because I used some colourful language. I accused him of moral cowardice because I felt that he was pandering to feminists rather than just looking at the fairness of justice. Um, so I think MPs should have the right to, also kind of. I suppose we expect people in that position to be a little bit professional and to rise above it, so to speak. But I mean, put it this way: if I insult an MP at some sort of public hustings and they responded in kind, I couldn't complain. So it's a point about mutual respect here, and the issue about potentially criminalising this is it's giving the impression that MPs are snowflakes, to put it plainly. So it's very important that we define what trolling is. If it's simply people calling an MP bad names on their Facebook page, well, there's options they can take. They can filter those sort of comments. They can reply to them and say something like, "I'm prepared to accept criticism, but you cannot, you know, I'm under no obligation to reply to those sort of comments," and so on. I often kind of put myself in their shoes. If I was an MP, I was a prominent MP. Of course, I'd get dissenting messages. MPs can just ignore them. The sort of hateful, vitriolic messages. You're a traitor to Britain. You're blah blah blah. They could ignore them. They could respond to them and point out why the person's wrong, or they could just address the concerns that the person has. So there's different approaches they can take. But I think if they immediately run to the police, it could potentially send out the wrong message. Um, it's not a level playing field. A voter does not have a level playing field with an MP who's in a position of power, who is making legislation that's impacting lives. So for me, this is very much about an issue of dissent as well. But to me, it just comes down to common sense. Where there are explicit threats, such as rape threats, that's disgusting, and I have no sympathy for people who are doing that and that being followed up. But I do have a feeling that some MPs would use that as an excuse to try and deflect all criticism. And we can't have a situation whereby, for example, women MPs cannot be criticised in case they say, "Oh, it's misogyny." Well, I hold the same standards of women and men MPs. So someone calls a woman MP a bitch. It's not pleasant, but how is that any different than calling a male MP a bastard? Where's the difference? I don't see any difference. I'm not saying it's right. I'm not saying that's the way people should go about things, but I am wary about certain MPs automatically getting into a victimhood mode because they're in a position of power, and frankly, sometimes they need to take it on the chin. So they can either rise above it, they can fight fire with fire, but if they're automatically talking about getting in legislation, we should be very wary of that. I really do think we need to be wary of that. But some things clearly are unacceptable. Rape threats, regardless of your politics, are plain wrong. Racist attacks are wrong. It doesn't matter if you can say, oh, well, for example, Diana Abbott has made anti-white comments. Well, if you're responding with anti-black racism, you're no better. Attack her for if you think she's a racist, then criticize her for that, but don't respond by using the fact she's a black woman to attack her. That's stupid. When you're attacking MPs, don't use their demographic so whether they be a woman or a man or Asian or black or whatever it is, attack them for their policies, for their views, but don't get into the gutter by using the same rhetoric that you're accusing them of. That's what I would say. So those are a few things to think about. Let me know your thoughts.